Hey Hayden, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining us.
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
And where are you based today?
Today I am in a small town in Mexico, where we spend, 3 or 4 months a year in the winter.
Oh wow. Do you have business down there as well, or is it relaxing?
We have one business, sort of a cabinetry business, but mainly it's relaxing.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you're in the US, where are you based?
I'm actually Canadian. So I'm in Toronto, Canada. I'm a Canadian living in Mexico who buys businesses in the US. So I've got North America covered.
You have indeed. With some Japanese ancestry, may I ask?
Yeah, my father is Japanese, my mother is English.
Do you spend any time in Japan these days?
Not for the last 20 years, not since
Yeah.
having kids, but
I
I'd love to.
I lived 18 years in Tokyo, so I have a fond association with Japan. So
Oh, wow.
yeah. How did you get involved? Tell us about your background and career-wise, and then lead us into how you got involved with Acquira.
Sure. So I've always been a bit of a rebel. Dropped out of high school at 17. Started my first business. I ended up basically probably starting 6 or 7 businesses between 17 and 25, 27, and then started getting into buying businesses. So at that time, it was mainly digital stuff, so software companies, sometimes blogs, smaller things, typically making between 300,000 $1 million a year. And I also had come up with a kind of unique internet marketing technique that I took some interns on. One of those interns happened to be a VC who was speaking at a conference in Mexico City. I was in Mexico, he came down, we hit it off, and we ended up starting a private equity firm, just this micro private equity focusing on digital acquisitions, called Wired Investors. That was back in 2015, 2016. So we bought and operated close to 20 businesses in the span of 3 or 4 years. And along the way, we kind of realized that there was this larger opportunity in helping others buy businesses and doing it at higher volume, specifically with the baby boomer generation retiring and a lot of jobs potentially being at risk. And so we started like Kingmakers, which we later rebranded as Acquira. That was back in 2019. In 2021, we also started a company called Snowball Industries with a couple partners, and we bought 4 sort of larger HVAC plumbing businesses, kind of integrated them all. And yeah, now our focus is on kind of building more roll-ups of specifically service-based businesses with a slightly different feel, in the sense that we are trying to set up ESOPs and getting them entirely employee owned.
Wow, a lot to unpack there. So let's go back a bit. And were you always interested in digital? And what was your interest as when you got into all of this?
Yeah, my first company was a web design and development company. I've always been really into computers. I'm part of the generation that I think I grew up with an immature technology, which taught me how to learn at an early age. So always been into computers. I ended up, my first business, I had a client that sold furniture, a very high-end Japanese inspired furniture, actually, with a showroom in Toronto. And I did their website and design and stuff. And I suggested, hey, I'm learning this thing called SEO, search engine optimization. At that time, Google wasn't even the biggest search engine. I want to test this out. And it worked really well. And within probably under a year, we were selling a bunch of $3,000 coffee tables to the US sight unseen in like 2003. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I got into it, and started building businesses based on that.
Okay. And what were some of your early experiences as an acquirer of businesses?
Actually, the first business I bought was on a website forum in 2004, and it was a kind of bead jewelry crafting business. So I think I bought it with a few $1,000s worth of inventory, and it was a fun experience, not very profitable. And then the next business I bought was just because I knew furniture. It happened to be, it's the one I mentioned at the beginning of the call. It's this cabinetry, sort of high-end artistic sculptural cabinetry, doors, windows, and furniture. And that was both a manufacturer and a retailer in Mexico. And we had partnered up with the other company I worked with and another furniture company to set up showrooms across the US. And then the recession kind of hit us pretty hard in 2009. And so we just kept the Mexico retail side and manufacturing side.
Were you on your own making these acquisitions, or did you have partners?
The jewelry one, I was on my own. The furniture one, I had a partner. And then ever since the formation of private equity firm, I've had a partner. Though I'm now the majority owner.
Okay.
Acquira.
Okay, so an obvious question, may I ask, how are you funding these acquisitions at that relatively early stage of your career?
The first couple were my own money. The second one was quite a bit of seller financing in addition. Then when we formed Wired Investors, the first several deals had its own separate LP base. So sort of a hybrid of equity and debt. And then the last probably 6 or 7 deals were all our own cash. And then with Acquira, it's a slightly different model where we end up coming in as a minority owner for the first deal. And the majority owner is an acquisition entrepreneur, we call them. So typically someone who's entering entrepreneurship for the first time, and this is the way that they're entering. And they own typically 80% of the business. We'll take 20. If they do quite well, that's sort of when we look at doing more of a roll-up with them.
Okay. Now, 2019 was on the doorstep of our friend COVID. So you launched that business, and I guess not everything went to plan, but you've moved through it. So talk us through that.
I mean, we were super lucky, but it made us look super smart. So at that time, we hadn't had a recession in like 12 years. And so I thought I wanted to move away from digital just because there were such inherent platform risks. And we had a couple situations where businesses, Google makes a change and a business drops, 70% overnight. It's just, you can't insure against it, right? So we were thinking about what space to buy in, where could we take advantage of some of the digital marketing skills we had, what would be fairly recession resilient. And we kind of landed on a bullet before cannonball test of an HVAC business. So HVAC plus it also did part of the business was like water purification in Phoenix. And so that was our first test. We bought it, I think, in September 2019. I think every other business that year was basically a digital business. And when COVID hit, it did exceptionally well. So yeah, it made us look smart. But
hey, that's half the battle, looking smart. Huh?
Yeah.
So, right now, looking at your website earlier, you support both buyers and sellers to achieve their goals in this area. So let's focus on sellers first. How could you support a seller in their journey here?
Yeah, so we help. We're more buyer centered in that we're not a broker. We don't work with sellers and charge a commission. We're more buyer centered. So we specifically work with buyers who are all pre-vetted. So we're not wasting sellers' time, and we often work with them, without a broker, meaning their employees don't have to know, their competitors don't have to know that they're for sale. So I mean that's the bare minimum. With some, one of the things that we're looking at now a lot more at it is this concept of selling to an employee. We just noticed with all the businesses we bought. I mean, we've bought close to 20 businesses in the brick and mortar space in the last few years. I think 95% of them, we ended up basically forming a leadership team within the company, never hiring an external GM. And then 95% of them already had someone who would have been that GM in the first place, right? And part of the issue was, maybe that GM or that person didn't have the capital or the credit, or even the knowledge that they could use the FBA and buy something quite cheaply. Maybe they didn't have external capital. We have an equity fund that finances basically 98% of the purchase between it and debt. It's 98%. And in some cases they may not have the experience. So we kind of looked initially at, well, why don't we help working with sellers wanting to sell directly to their employees? And that kind of turned into, well, why don't we help work with sellers looking at setting up an ESOP trust, because there's a lot of strong tax benefits for the seller, and it aligns very much with our goal of trying to have these employee-owned companies.
Okay, so the profile of a qualified buyer, what are some examples? Who is that person? What are they trying to accomplish? What stage of their business career are they at? And what sort of finance? You said 98% could be funded. So what sort of financial means do they need to have?
The buyer, there's a couple different personas. I think the most common is someone who works in a leadership position within corporate America, and who's always wanted to be an entrepreneur, is typically saved up to $300,000 to be used for a down payment, and has likely been researching buying a business for at least over a year. So that's, I would say, close to 2/3 of the people who buy business with us. The other third are actually people who've started and sold businesses in the past and want to get back into entrepreneurship, but really don't want to go through the hassle of a startup and the blood, sweat, and tears on finding product market fit and all that. In terms of the capital required, so a lot of people buy through SBA. I think the SBA, the whole 7(a) program primarily exists to help solve this demographic issue. And so they have they guarantee 75% of the loan, which allows banks to, be quite liberal with the terms of these loans. So 10-year amortizations, loan to value ratio of sometimes up to 95% technically. More practically, it's like 85%. And then we have an equity fund that can come in and cover, up to 80% of the actual down payment portion. So if people choose to go with that, they could come in with as little as 2% of the purchase price. Some people, do it without the equity fund, and they'll usually typically come up with 10 to 10%-ish. Okay,
so these people are relatively experienced and accomplished, probably. And do they have an interest in a particular industry area, usually?
So they're generally pretty industry agnostic, and what we have specializations in certain spaces. And so we'll typically work with people in those spaces. So it's a lot more related to kind of home and property services. There's some manufacturing as well. It will depend. Domain expertise, it's interesting. I'd say 80% of business tastes like chicken, right? The other 20% often can be learned in 6 to 12 months, barring some very specific, niches. That being said, what we found with especially some of the early acquisitions was like that integration, the change management component is really very, very, very crucial. And so we set up a whole kind of change management division within the company. And so whenever a partner of ours buys a business, we actually go on site with them for the first week. And we'll actually go and set up the leadership team and help run workshops over the first year.
Right.
And otherwise I just feel like we're introducing too much risk.
Okay, so you're providing, I guess, a service. We can come to that to ease the transaction after it's complete. What about the education of the buyer prior to them pulling the trigger on that?
Yeah, that's typically a 12-month process through our own program. It's called the Accelerator program. I think the fastest someone's gone through it is 6 months, but generally it's more like 12 months.
Right. And what's some of the curriculum in that program?
It's a lot of financial education. There's also a component on, obviously, on the search and diligence, right? And then there's a whole component on, which is called ACE, which is about the integration side, right?
Okay.
We also recommend people read about 7 books throughout that process.
Okay. Give us an example of one of those books.
Sure. So for management, Radical Candor, for finance, financial intelligence, all of Jim Collins' stuff for, in general, leadership.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Scaling up for operations.
Okay. And the expectation here, of course, is that this buyer is going to be very hands-on in the business they buy, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
They'll be on site.
There's no financial investors who are building a portfolio. These people are going to come and take over the running of the business.
Yeah, that acquisition entrepreneur is the day-to-day operator.
Yeah.
Like I said, we have an equity fund. We do have a passive component, but that's apart from that.
Okay. Okay, good. I'm getting the picture here. So if a deal goes ahead, are you always an investor as well from inception, or does it depend on various factors?
I mean, we're always an investor if it matches our criteria, I should say. And so typically the presentation to our own investment committee, like the equity fund, will happen, we call it after the FID, final investment decision. So it's after the POE comes back, it's after an integrator's done a site visit. And at that point where, the acquisition entrepreneur wants to buy the business, nothing strange has come up with the numbers, nothing strange has come up with, the attitude or relationship with the seller. At that point, the business is probably 95% going to close, the other 5% being acts of God, right?
Right, got it. So you spoke about the what I'd call a management buyout type of structure, right? Where employees or an employee looks to own the business by which they're employed. So in that case, they would be your buyer. They fit the profile of the buyer. And one of the potential disadvantages of that is, there's a lot of advantages. They know the business well, they know the customers, they know the mechanics of the business. There's often trust between them and the current owners. Often they don't have a lot of cash. So, but I think what you're telling me is that that's exactly the gap that you're filling, perhaps.
Yep. In that instance, they're often coming in also with SBA. And SBA, if they don't have assets, that's not an issue. They would need to have a decent credit rating, right? But the cash side, that's one of the things that we come in to help with, and also the leadership development side. It's a large piece, and so they might be more like a service manager in the business, and they just maybe they've never even seen the finances of the business. So that side of it, I think people could often use some help.
What about this idea, Hayden? Many people would say leadership and management can be learned to some degree. There are tactics and best practices that we can practice and learn. But entrepreneurship, the assumption of risk for the success of a business and the stress of that, both in positive and negative ways, is something that is not so easily learned. So there's a lot of people sitting in businesses looking at the owners saying, yeah, I could do this, I could run this place, but are maybe not as appraised of all of the implications of being an owner and having that ultimate responsibility, and therefore are maybe not suited to ownership. Have you encountered that? Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, though I would say it can be eased. So the typical profile of a business we buy is very much that of it's like a startup, right? So I kind of look at businesses as this concept of like a startup will grow up and a scale up, right? A startup, you have basically everyone wearing a bunch of different hats, typically don't have very clear job descriptions or scorecards, any of those things, right? And everyone's doing a little bit of everything. In a grow up, you typically do actually have separate job descriptions. You do have scorecards. There's best practices in place. What you may not have yet is a finance division to lower your cost of capital to allow you to scale in multiple geographies, right? As an example. I think the really hard part in a business is actually getting from startup to grow up. And it's actually getting to the point where you have enough cash flowing from the business that you can invest in that sort of management and even maybe one executive layer, right? And what's interesting, that takes years, right? And what's interesting is when you buy one of these businesses, they actually, $1 million of EBITDA, they're actually financially capable of supporting it. They just operationally haven't done it, right? Because they're startups still, right? That means the owner's wearing 5 hats, right? He or she is managing the finances, managing new hires, managing the company culture, probably doing a bunch of sales work, right? And so our whole system here is how can we implement best practices into these sort of $1 million a year startups to get them to these management run grow ups as quickly as possible. If you can do that, you take a lot of those stressors on the entrepreneur away, right? If you have someone else who's helping manage the financial component, if you have someone else, every single one of these businesses, we hire a people and culture person to take a lot of the relational drama away from the acquisition entrepreneur, and also to just focus on hiring, because a lot of these businesses, they're constrained by supply, right? Yeah. So I agree with your statement. That was a very long answer to say I agree with your statement. However, I think it could be eased. And so whereas maybe only 5% of the population is born with the stress tolerance to be, a startup entrepreneur as it is, maybe more like 30% could do it in this format.
I like that model. That makes sense. And you're heavily invested in the success of these businesses anyway, right? So you want to make it work. Do you deploy your own team members to support the businesses, or I think you said you're hiring people into the businesses, or both?
Yeah, so a typical, so we have an integration team, and that integration team has sort of a lead integrator, a finance integrator, a people and culture integrator, and sort of a revenue integrator, right? And those people go to support the businesses or support them remotely, a combination. The actual businesses themselves, we always suggest that you build a leadership team from within whenever possible. There's a lot of private equity companies that really just focus on, I'm going to hire an external CEO, often with zero experience in the industry, and just expect 30 to 50% exodus. I don't agree with that. We aim for 10% in the first year burn. So yeah, a combination.
Right. The long-term rewards for your business and for the new owners, is there some kind of longer-term exit strategy for these businesses, or is it more of a cash flow opportunity, or both?
Both. So if our equity fund participates, typically the goal would be for there to be an exit opportunity for those fund members within 5 years. However, there's nothing to say, we don't want to go and exit it to an external private equity company. That would probably be more of a refinance on our side. And like I said, I think our main goal is to find a lot of these acquisition entrepreneurs that are capable and willing and interested in building a larger roll-up, and then doing that whole ESOP model.
Right, and that's why you're interested in very specific industries, I think, so you can learn the dynamics of that, right? Like HVAC.
Correct.
Yeah. How many deals have you done, may I ask, if that's public knowledge? Or
about close to 40.
Yeah. That's really great. I mean, considering 2019 and everything that's happened, and also that's not that long and deals are hard to do. So that's a great track record.
Oh, thank you.
And you've got some winners in there and maybe some less winners. Is that a fair?
Yeah, so I should state the 40 includes the digital stuff. So it's about 20 and 20.
Okay.
In the non-digital, we have no losers. If I define loser as, the business is no longer able to pay its debt.
Right.
We've not defaulted on any deals. We've got some giant winners, some slight winners. When we forecast now going forward, sort of a pro forma on a new business acquisition that's not employee owned, right? I always assume probably a 10% dip to EBITDA year one as you introduce more of these costs for becoming management run, and probably a doubling of the business within something like 5 to 6 years.
Okay.
Right. That's the typical average growth trajectory we've seen. And like I said, some we've hit a home run, and some have done worse, but none have defaulted.
Sounds like a really good track record. So Hayden, coming to our audience, which is accounting businesses, we serve in Australia, New Zealand, North America, and Europe. And my perception is many of them are sitting on excellent relationships that that they've built over many years, decades in some cases. They often speak to the owners of the business, certainly the leadership teams, and those leaders engage the accountants on strategic matters, on important matters. And one of those is succession. I was just with an accounting business yesterday, was telling me about their client, which is a manufacturer of hydraulic equipment, and quite a substantial business with 2 partners. One is older, one is younger. And it looks like early days, but it looks like they don't share exactly the same vision for how this will all unfold. And one of them is saying, well, maybe I should buy you out. And the accountant was asking us the question, how do we tackle a challenge like this? I mean, and that comes down to what do we do? What's the process? And how do we get paid for it? Because you can spend a lot of time talking to people about these some of the biggest decisions they'll ever make in their lives. And 6 months on, you've spoken to them a lot, and they've decided, now we'll just stay as we are. And if you didn't get paid for that time, it's tricky. So I guess there are accountants who will really jump into that succession planning or exit planning role and succeed at it. I think there's others who probably don't want to do that. They want to focus on other things that they're more comfortable with. One thing I'd like to explore is there a way for you guys, Acquira, to work with accountants to try and help the entrepreneurs, in that case, the client, that we must focus on that, and maybe the accountants can benefit from your activities as well in some way. So let's explore that.
Yeah, for sure. I would say in any instance where a owner of a company has indicated that they're looking to sell the business or even come up with an exit plan for the business, whether that is to an employee, to a partner, or externally, that's somewhere that we can definitely help, and we can definitely, compensate the accountants for that. Typically we're not a broker, but typically we can, say 1% of the purchase price as an example. The pretty standards for finder's fee for this. And I would say that, there are certain industries that we specialize in, other industries that we don't. So things like, restaurant and dry cleaners, anything that I would say is highly localized with, an under 30-mile service area, is probably something we won't touch. Yeah. But we'll cover almost all others type of service businesses. Yeah. And some manufacturers. And if we just think through the process there, so an accountant, and I know many instances of this, one of their clients has indicated an interest in transitioning the business in some form. They're very protective of their relationships to some degree, and they want to do the best for their clients. So what would that process look like? They introduce you. What would you do next? They would introduce us to the seller. We would basically have a call with the seller and talk about what their plans are. Potentially come out and fly out and physically visit if it's a good fit. we collect financials. We'd want to make sure that they have tax returns for the past 3 years, P&Ls, that type of thing. And then if there's a way that we can work together, either by, like I said, buying the business from them directly with one of our acquisition entrepreneurs, or sponsoring one of their employees, or if it's a slightly larger business, probably 1.5 million EBITDA or up, actually doing the ESOP. Those are all certainly options.
I like that. It's good to be flexible on the options, because each of these businesses is quite different, and they'll have different agenda, different timelines, different sizes, etc. I'm also, when you say you need to do a degree of financial due diligence up front, there could be a way where the accountant is engaged to support in this process, because obviously that's their core skill set, right? So yeah, okay. Well, I can see some opportunity for accountants there. What else might we cover here about your business, or how you could work with accountants, or are we done?
I mean, there's always the buy side. If accountants ever want to buy a business, they can always work with us as well. So there's that side. We have the standard accelerator program that they could go through. And then also, as we are doing these roll-ups, we're always looking for, strong accountants to be really kind of fractional CFOs in a lot of the companies we work with. And as these, roll-ups develop, obviously looking for that at a larger scale.
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems to me this is less about a transactional approach. If I were recommending to an accountant to consider working with you guys, it would be less try to make 1% on a deal and just throw stuff out there. And it's more about, in the same way that you go about it, building the relationships long-term and participating and making the interests of the client, let's focus entirely on that. How do we help them to achieve what they want? And they have considerable skills, as you say, as financial advisors and accountants and process-oriented people, and you bring a different skill set. So it's about finding the synergies there. I like that. And that, I think, helps us distinguish what you do from, there's a lot of brokers out there. There's a lot of brokers who pitch to accountants and say, hey guys, if you've got deals coming up, flick them my way and I'll cut you in somewhere. And I don't think that's what we're talking about here at all. It's a deeper, that may happen in some instances, but it's a more comprehensive relationship, right? Yeah.
Yeah, our goal is to buy thousands of businesses. And that goes along with working with a lot of accountants. That's definitely a long-term relationship.
Good. Well, Hayden, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Was there anything else you wanted to cover at this point?
Nothing on my end.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, and I think our audience is going to enjoy hearing from you, and we may follow up in some ways. So we'll close up there and wish you a great day in Mexico, and perhaps see you in Toronto or the US at some point.
Sounds great.
All right.